Hi, so this is one of those videos that I've tried to upload a few times now, but I'm having some problems with the links because advertisements keep appearing, the screen is freezing, and I just have to keep uploading this. So I'm going to try and make this brief and just touch on the basic points that I want to discuss. And that is that yesterday, Tuesday, so today, UK, yesterday now, Japan. Three men were executed, and these are the first executions in Japan in 2 years. They were hanged. It doesn't say the jurisdiction. I believe it was Tokyo, but it doesn't specify that. It's significant because it's once again sort of opened up a debate, or rather, it's shone a light on Japan's somewhat unusual system. So a bit of context is important here. These men were all convicted of murder. They were all men, all convicted of murder, and all three were hanged. Um, Two of the men appear to be involved in the same case, the other was in a different case. All the crimes were from the 21st century, so the 2000s, the crimes occurred. Japan and the United States are the only two countries in the G7 that still use the death penalty. And they have different methods. In Japan, it's hanging. In the United States, it's lethal injection. And big thing about Japan, the notable thing about Japan is the way it's done, in which the condemned is only informed of on the morning of their execution of what will happen. Now, it's become a little bit more transparent in recent years, but it's still quite vague on the details. In fact, it's only in the last 10, 15 years that they even release the names of the condemned. Whether this is to not put attention on criminals or whether it is a lack of transparency in the justice system, I don't know. But before I continue talking about this case, or rather the Japan model, I want to just be clear about my position. Death penalty is a very emotive subject. People have strong views on both sides. I've always been conservative on crime. I believe that when people commit crime, when they hurt society, they should pay a price. And I think the more serious the crime, the more serious the price should be. But I have also always been uneasy about the death penalty, primarily because I think that when mistakes are made, there's no turning back. That's my number one unease about the death penalty. It's not so much that I have a great sense of unease that someone who's done a terrible thing is executed by the state, although I do think that that fundamentally that's what it is. It's a state killing someone. But it's not so much that. I mean, there are crimes you hear about that are just so sadistic and so gratuitously violent and evil that it makes your stomach turn. And, being hanged is clearly not, com- it's not comparable to what the criminal done to the victim because with hanging, with the long drop, it is a quick death. It's not a prolonged death. Um, Not the way it's done today. Certainly in this country, in the past, you had it was pretty brutal. The condemned would be literally swinging there. It wasn't until the 1820s that we introduced the long drop, and then the last public execution, 1868, Michael Barrett. He was an Irish nationalist responsible or charged with the Clerkenwell bombing, which killed 12 people, the first modern terrorist attack in London. Uh, well, modern enough. Um, and then, of course, our last executions were 1964 at Manchester and Liverpool simultaneously. At the time, it wasn't really marked because the death penalty was still in statute. And it's not like that was a significant occasion because the death penalty was still there and it was finally abolished in 1967. But today in Britain, many people want a return of the death penalty. I don't want to throw out figures. I don't know what the figures are, but certainly, you get tabloids saying a majority of our readers want a return of uh, hanging and so on. So it's not clear cut that countries that don't have the death penalty, public opinion ties with that, and countries that do have a totally different way of thinking. I think that's a little bit of a misconception. Um, because, victims of crime anywhere want to see justice. Um, but I do think there's something unusual about the the lack of transparency in the Japanese system, and considering it's a modern country, developed country, it's a democracy, I don't really know if there's much justification for that lack of transparency. Um, One thing that concerns me about the Japanese system is the high reliance on confessions. In Japan, the rate of confessions is very, very high. It's well over 90%. In other words, it's either a case of very effective police work or there's coercion going on, and inmates, or rather the condemned, are being forced to confess things. I think that does deserve some scrutiny. I'm not naive. I understand that in Japan there's wide support for this, and if I had lost my family member to a crazed murderer, I would probably, have zero sympathy with them. And I don't know which system would be worse. I don't know if you're a condemned inmate, if it would be worse knowing, say you're in a Florida or Texas correctional facility and or condemned cell even, and you're told you're going to die on the 25th of July 2032. That's an exact time, it's an exact frame. You can have appeals, you might have clemency from the governor, but that's it. That's the date you die. In Japan, it could be tomorrow or it could be in 10 years. Um, and I'm not sure why that is, because let's say you have two murderers and one has to wait 10 years and the other just waits a few years. Well, then the punishment isn't equal there. So that doesn't make much sense. But one thing I always think about when I think of the Japanese model is a famous case. And I covered this case. I'll put a link to the video I made. A boxer by the name of Aweo Hakamada actually is in the Guinness Book of Records for having the longest time on death row in the world, documented at least. And basically, in the mid 1960s, he was charged with a mass murder and he was put on death row. And it wasn't until, I believe, 2014. Initially, I quoted this case, I quoted parts from the Wikipedia article, but like I say, I was having problems with the links. So I'll just put a link onto this rather than read it out. Basically, he was finally exonerated because it was shown that evidence had been fabricated. Now, that is not to say that the three men executed yesterday were were in the same position. It's not to say that there was also a miscarriage of justice, but it shows even in a developed country like Japan, miscarriages of justice can happen. Now, his case attracted a lot of international attention because of his age, because of the length of time he was on death row. And even within Japan, there were legislators who petitioned for his release. There was the Japan Boxing Federation petitioned for his release. Reuben Carter, the American boxer whose life was made into the biopic The Hurricane with Denzel Washington, petitioned for his release. And he was released. He's still alive. He's 85 now. But to me, that shows that even a country that has very low crime rates, and this is something that should be noted about Japan, it's one of the safest countries in the world. For a country of 125 million people, it has less than 1,000 homicides. It is a very safe country. So clearly they're doing something right. But the lack of transparency in their death row system and the reliance on confessions are both factors I think need some scrutiny. I'm not saying that the Japanese police aren't efficient, but I think it would be naive to say there's no corruption. I mean, this is a country where it's actually not illegal to be a yakuza, a member of an organized criminal, violent organized criminal fraternity. Yet, you know, when it comes to the death penalty, there's a lack of transparency there. So I think that's somewhat contradictory. You would think that a country that's so tough on crime, you'd think that being a criminal would be illegal. So I don't understand that contradiction. Maybe someone from Japan can explain that. I think it might be to do with the fact that in Japan, organized crime is a bit more than crime. It goes back to clans, the pre-feudal clan system. So Yakuza often have social status. I think there's probably a factor in that. But there is, you know, it seems that there's some corruption going on there if Yakuza are protected by the legal system, if that is the case. Um, but I also want to address another point because on the video about this story, the comments were a little bit knee jerk and they were all like, "Oh well, they deserve it. They're murderers and so on." Um, they're probably guilty. I mean, I think the system is quite rigorous. They probably are guilty. And although violent crime in Japan isn't common, it does happen. I've heard of some awful cases there. In fact, not long ago, a few days ago, there was a fire in Osaka. 24 people were killed, and it's thought that may have been arson. Now, to me, that's pure evil, taking 24 lives deliberately. And if someone like that is proven to be guilty, it's hard to argue they shouldn't pay the ultimate price. But again, it's a lack of transparency and the fact that mistakes can happen because there's no going back from that. But what I find noticeable is that, particularly in Asian countries, now a lot of Asian countries actually most of the world has now abolished the death penalty. But in Asian countries that have there tends to be a resentment about outside observations of this or outside commentary. It tends to be, you know, Europeans are have this really liberal left attitude, and um, well, we're tough on our criminals, particularly obviously in Southeast Asia, it's famous for the mandatory death penalty for drug traffickers. Again, what if someone's planted with drugs? I have serious questions about due process in some jurisdictions. And by the way, I'm not saying my country's perfect. I've often criticized the British justice system, but for the other reason, I think we're too soft. So the truth is, there's no perfect system in the world, but where the death penalty is in statute, I think the need for transparency, the need for it to be foolproof, is absolutely essential. And I'm not sure that it is, even in Japan. And if a modern developed democracy like Japan can have flaws, imagine what's going to be like in a single party state like China, which executes thousands every year. There has unquestionably been miscarriages of justice in China. There was a young man in Beijing accused of raping a woman in the late 80s, and in China, rape is, at least it was, I don't know about today, but it was one of the crimes which carried the death penalty, and he was executed. Years later, it was proven that he was innocent, and the family got compensation, but that doesn't bring him back. Um, so one thing that bothers me about the death penalty debate, particularly on videos, people don't give a lot of thought to it. They just say, "Oh well, the murderers, they get what they deserve," and they make the observation, "Well, the victims don't choose when they die." That's true. That is true. But this is a very important subject, and people therefore should give thought to it. People shouldn't be flippant about this. They shouldn't outright dismiss it or outright support it, because there are nuances. There are many angles to consider. Um, I'm going to wrap this up soon, but I'll put links to the video I made about it and Aweo Hakamada case, and maybe also this case. I should say the new Justice Minister has said that he stressed that this is something he considered very, very carefully and went over it again and again. So I'm not saying that Japan does this flippantly. I'm not saying that it isn't meticulous, but I do think that there are valid questions about the lack of transparency. I mean, one of the aspects of democracy is that issues that are in the public interest, like crime and justice, surely should be transparent as much as possible. Um, and I know that most people in Japan still support it. But I'll just close with this thought. For those saying that Europe's really liberal left, a lot of Britons want a return of the death penalty. So it's not like British people think very differently from Japanese people. in terms of crime. That's not the case at all. In fact, there's people here, like I say, who want a return of the death penalty. And likewise, in Japan, there will be a minority of people who are against the death penalty. Um, Even in the American situation, it varies greatly from state to state. I understand that about half of all executions every year in the United States occurs in the state of Texas, one state. So other states that have the death penalty in statute, either they carry out very few executions or it's extremely rare to the point where they either put a moratorium on it or they abolish it completely. In fact, Virginia this year abolished the death penalty. For abolitionists, that's a positive thing. Um, I think it does desensitize people because there's this knee-jerk reaction that if someone opposes the death penalty, they're therefore soft on crime, that they don't think criminals should be punished. I actually think there's an argument to be made that life imprisonment is a bigger punishment than the death penalty. So, if someone commits a terrible crime, you could argue actually the death penalty is a way out. Whereas if they're serving life imprisonment, every single day they're in that cell, they have to think about what they've done and their life is taken away. So arguably that's a harsher punishment. It's something to think about. Um, Ultimately, I think justice should be about justice and not revenge. But there have been some awful crimes in Japan, even a country that has low crime rates. I heard about a case of a young woman, student, high school student. Um, I forget which city it was in, but she was kidnapped by some boys in her class. And basically, she was tortured, repeatedly raped, brutalized. And she died of her injuries. This was in the late 80s. I think it was 1989. It's quite a well known case. And it opened up to a moral debate about youth delinquency. Um, but what's interesting is the offenders in that case got quite lenient sentences. And what that young woman went through is pure evil, pure evil. I forget the name of her or the case, but cases like that, you think there are some people out there who are beyond rehabilitation. But the death penalty, I just think that there are serious flaws, and I would simply say to those who have a knee-jerk response to this, you need to consider every angle, because a miscarriage of justice is a terrible, terrible thing. I mean, imagine serving years in prison for a crime you didn't commit, and especially the prospect of being executed. And everyone thinking that you're a terrible murderer when you might actually be innocent. So that combination of a very, very high confession rate and the lack of transparency, I think raises questions for Japan. Um, I imagine it's a bit like Texas. I don't think it's going to be abolished anytime soon, but there might come a turning point. I think if there are some other cases like that of Awao Hakamada, then public attitudes might change because in Britain, that's exactly what happened. Film Pierpoint about one of Britain's last hangmen, it mistakenly said he was the last. He wasn't actually Albert Pierpoint. He was one of the last. It shows how public attitudes starkly changed from the 1930s and 1940s when there was wide public support for it to the change in public opinion in the late 50s and 60s when the majority of the public went against it. Now, what we've seen in the last 30 years with violent crime rates having gone up again, public opinion has perhaps shifted back to let's bring back the death penalty. I wouldn't support that. I'd be uneasy about it. What I do think we should have in this country is much tougher sentences. Certainly for young offenders, I think that we should consider reintroducing national service specifically for young offenders, not for all young people. But anyone from Japan who's watching this, what's your thoughts? Are you familiar with the Awe Hakamada incident? And I want to be very clear, I'm not saying these men were innocent. Probably they were guilty, and maybe they should have been executed. I don't know, but I'm uneasy about it for those reasons. And if you support it, I would simply ask you about that. The high confession rate and the lack of transparency. Do you not think that creates a flaw in the system? I do. Let me know your thoughts.